Greetings, class, and welcome to week 5 of CIS 4710. This is Professor Brown, and this week we're going to be talking about scanning here. And with that, let's get started. So, scanning is one of those areas that comes, of course, after footprinting, and it's before enumeration, and it's where we collect significant data that goes into the enumeration process. So we're going to be paying particular attention here at port scanning to find out what actually is open and available on a server or device, and then vulnerability scanning, scanning that device against known baselines of vulnerabilities. So with that, you've done a lot of this already in Lab 1. This is kind of to put things together and put some of the theoretical knowledge behind it. So TCP and UDP both support, the 65,536 ports that are available to each protocol, and each protocol consists of commonly used ports, are what were known as administrative ports, which are ports 0 through 1023. Network services bind to these ports and listen on the ports in order to accept traffic and then serve up content, such as a web page or a mail service. Open ports indicate that an application is listening on that port. Now, not all ports have to be used for their common functionality. You can move ports around. For example, I could set up an FTP server on port 65,534. Completely legal, completely doable. I just have to set my clients up to access that port on to do so. Same thing can be done with a web page. So this is where we get into scanning ports for, say, quote, dark, end quote, web pages. So dark web pages would be on ports that are non-traditional ports, not 80, not 443, not 8080, etc. They're on a higher end port that you actually have to know what port it is, and that's how they mask their availability. So the de facto port map scanner that you're going to use and get very familiar with and very comfortable with is going to be Nmap. It supports a lot of different types of scans. It supports different types of TCP scans, UDP scans, SYN, ACK, FIN, EXMA scans, etc. The default is going to be about the first 1,000 or so well-known ports. But we can also manipulate Nmap and other scanners like OpenVOS to scan additional ports. So let's focus in on what a SYN scan is and what it does. So this takes advantage of the TCP three-way handshake, and Nmap sends a SYN packet to the device on a port, a specific port, and if that port answers, we know that, hey, there's an application there. We may not know what the application is, but we can deduce that it is a common type of application. So if port 80 answers to a SYN, we know that it's probably a web server. And then if we get back header information, we can deduce that, oh, it's a known web server type like IIS or Apache. If the port is closed, the protocol definition says to respond with the segment that has a reset flag instead. So we get a reset back, we know, hey, that port's closed. If the port is open, it's going to give us a SYN ACK. If the port is open, Nmap will then send an RST message in response to the SYN ACK to cancel the connection attempt so we don't get detected. That is typically how that works. However, you can manipulate Nmap in such a way that it does not send that reset message. We just let that request time out. That's a better methodology to use, because if a server sees a reset packet or a lot of reset packets, or if an IPS detects a lot of reset packets, you know you're getting scanned. A full connect scan works essentially the same as a SYN scan. The difference is that Nmap is going to do that three-way handshake and complete that three-way handshake in order to establish a connection, like I was saying before. This is a better way to do it so that you don't get detected. However, it takes a lot longer because there's more overhead involved with it, and a lot of half-open connections from your SYN scan may be more noticeable instead of using a full connect scan. In reality, all port scans are easily identified by modern networks and security devices, modern IPS devices, because these security companies that have developed the IPS detectors, guess what they do? They use Nmap, and they go through and they scan, and they look at what the traffic looks like. They look at Wireshark, and they're able to detect it. It's only when you get into different types of scan, maybe like a fin scan, that you can kind of obfuscate yourself a little bit. Now, with a fin scan, we're going to send out the fin message, which is unnatural. It means there's no connection there, but we want to close a connection. All right, we're basically telling the device that, hey, we are closing the connection. If the port is open, the packet's going to get dropped. If the port is closed, it will respond with a RST. And then, hey, it basically tells you, no, this port's not open. So basically, we can find out if a port is open with a fin scan if nothing responds back. And Nmap will flag open ports as filtered. Firewall dropping the packet for any type of reason will result in no response. So Nmap can't tell if that port is open or not. It's just dropped. So this is very inconclusive. An XMIS scan is very similar to a fin scan because the target host responds in the same way. Flags such as fin, push, and urgent aren't typically set, making it appear as though the packet is lit up like a Christmas tree. I like how they put that. It was thought that an unnatural combination of flags would be missed by firewalls and intrusion detection systems, so many get through where most standard scans would not. However, most common types of XMIS scans that are put together, again, are seen by intrusion prevention systems. So typically, what you're saying here is an XMIS scan is not going to get through because an IP and even host-based systems won't respond to it. An idle scan. Avoiding detection can be very important. Your IP may get blocked if you are detected. It might get blocked for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, forever. You never know. An idle scan will spoof the source IP address, and you can then use a zombie if that zombie should be idle to get network traffic. Nmap will use that spoofed source address of the zombie host, and the zombie host OS increments initial sequence numbers based off of inbound traffic. So in essence, Nmap can determine whether a port is open based on the number of packets that the zombie receives. This is way more complicated because you need to have two different systems. UDP scanning. So since UDP is a connectionless protocol, we never get a response back. So there's different ways that we can use UDP in order for us to identify whether a port is open or not. Since we do that, the Nmap program will send a UDP message to a port. The application may or may not be listening on. If the right message isn't received, the application is simply going to ignore it. Because there's no defined response, Nmap can't tell if the message was ignored or dropped. So UDP scanning can be very slow and arduous with this. So other scanners that are available for port scanning, and there's a lot of them. Mass scan, we talk a little bit about that this week in the reading, along with HPing and FPing. HPing is where we can manually craft packets to send to a target. And a lot of times, if you're trying to defeat a intrusion prevention system, you have to be very crafty and do a lot of manual scanning. So if you can find a device on a subnet that's, say, listening to port 22 or port 80, you know that subnet's alive, and then you have to be kind of arduous about going through each individual IP or other types of scanning to do that. You can also do this with just general browser. So browsers you can put in and see if a website is on a non-traditional port by putting a colon and the port number behind the IP address. So let's move on to vulnerability scanners. And excuse me, we've been working a lot with OpenVOS over the last few weeks. So a lot of common vulnerability scanners are going to use the database's signatures from the National Vulnerability Database to find out if a system has a specific type of operating system, and if so, is that operating system susceptible to this attack? It may ask for different types of information, and it gives you an overall score as to the likelihood of the vulnerability. And then you can see with certainty, is it 90% possible, 80% possible, 70% possible? You can then formulate attacks off of those vulnerabilities. And these types of application banners, which we get version numbers, that's how we do that. So vulnerability scanners don't generally attempt to exploit a vulnerability. They just try to detect with a certain likelihood that the vulnerability exists. So that's based off of common vulnerabilities and exposures, or CVEs. These are managed by Meter, which is a defense contractor, and the scanners commonly scan against these CVEs for published vulnerabilities. Again, no 0 days here, folks. If there's a 0 day that's not published, we don't know about it. They can also scan for misconfigurations, common misconfigurations, common passwords like Cisco or something of that nature. The CVE database is going to include well-defined details in a standard format regardless of vendor. So if you have an open telnet port, for example, it might identify that there's an open telnet port, and it might identify that it's single authentication, for example, uses a password only. Then it may go to a subroutine and try some common passwords, like password, against that open telnet port. So again, we go over a lot of these open common vulnerability scanners. You worked a lot with OpenVOS, which was forked from the last open source version of Nessus. Nessus is now closed and it's sold by Nessus. And it is you can actually download a Home Essentials version and scan up to, I think, 16 or 32 IPs. Really good for home use. Nexpose from Rapid7 leans a lot on the Metasploit framework. Qualys, which is also another commercial scanner, but it's all online, so you actually are using that from centralized locations. It takes a lot of work to get Qualys working effectively. They still do have on-prem servers that you can order, or on-prem software you can download and register, but the online application that they sell is by far their most popular. So the positives and the negatives. This is a very important slide. You need to know it. You will see this information again. A false positive. The scanner identified a vulnerability that does not exist. A true positive. The scanner identified a vulnerability that does exist. A false negative. A scanner didn't identify a vulnerability where one exists, which is like the worst thing you can do. A true negative. Scanner didn't identify a vulnerability where no vulnerability exists. And a false negative is the scariest here in their opinion, since you have no awareness of the existing vulnerability. That's a 0 day, basically. So, in summary, port scanning is used to identify the listening of applications and services. There are all different types of scans. Go back and look at those and know their definitions. Also, the CVE database, the false positives, false negatives, you'll see that information again. they're only good for identifying known vulnerabilities. Again, 0 days won't work here. Vulnerability scanners can use information off of common CVE databases like the National Vulnerability Database. So this is not your lab assignment, so you can ignore that slide. Do want to cover real quick the syllabus for this week, week 5. Let me just bring this over. So for week 5, again, scanning, we're going to start working on lab 2 this week. Lab 1 is actually due at the end of this week. I moved that a week here. I'm sorry for that, not there. And we'll also talk about homework 3 and homework 4 a little bit this week as well. So a lot to do. I really focus in a lot on these scanning and footprinting and vulnerability scanners because you will be using them all the time. They help you out a lot with enumeration of the servers that we are attacking. So it's very important that you dig into these scanners and start to understand how their inner workings operate. Spend a little bit of time doing some searches on the scanners and especially in-map scripts. In-map scripts are very important. They help you out a lot in the field. Anyway, that's it for this week. I'm going to sign off. I wish you luck, and I will have another lab lecture open here hopefully by Thursday. Be on the lookout for that. Thanks a lot, and have a great week, everybody.